You're on CYInterview.
I'm Christianic. Featured columnist Jay Bilstein is with me today on CYInterview. We welcome current Neon Museum scholar Dr. Fawn Chung. She is a retired University of Nevada, Las Vegas history professor who taught at the academic institution for almost 40 years. She holds degrees from Harvard University, UCLA, and the University of California, Berkeley. On Wednesday, May 26th at 7 p.m. Pacific, she will give an online presentation about the history of Chinese Americans in Las Vegas. Professor, thank you so much for joining us today on CYInterview. How are you?
Fine, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Tell me about what we can look forward to from your Zoom presentation in conjunction with the Neon Museum this coming Wednesday.
Well, one of the things you can expect is because the Chinese have been, or Chinese Americans have been ignored or forgotten, and any of the contributions that they made really haven't stuck in the history books or in the minds of the people, you're going to learn about what some of the Chinese Americans did, how they lived in Las Vegas, who some of the community leaders were, and how those who were, for example, in the restaurant business used neon lights, and those in Chinatown, when they developed the Chinatown Mall, also used neon lights.
Doctor, you know, I find that this is coming up at a very, very important point in time, not simply in terms of Las Vegas, but in terms of geopolitics, in terms of, in my own opinion, the less than honorable, I would say shameful behavior of the last administration in the United States in terms of many groups of people who maybe were perceived to be from other countries, even though there were people even though the United States is a nation of immigrants composed of people from all over the world, many of whom have been in the country for generations and generations. Do you in any way, shape, or form plan to touch on a geopolitical context and a national political context in this presentation?
Only briefly. I wish I had more time, but they've limited the number of minutes that I can speak and the number of words that I can put in my essay for them. But I can go on and on this subject, and I think that it's really a disservice to the Chinese Americans and the people of China, whether they're in the People's Republic or in the Republic of China, that is in Taiwan or on the mainland, and all of those who are in Chinese diasporas throughout the world, that you blame the flu on the Chinese and you say they are the ones who caused it and therefore we should get rid of them, which is basically what was being said.
And it is beyond the pale and despicable beyond belief. And, you know, I don't know who said originally that, you know, those who forget history are condemned to repeat it. If I recall correctly, and I would think you probably have a better grasp on this than I do, I believe that the so-called Spanish flu from 1918 didn't come from Spain at all, and quite frankly, the point of origin may well have been the United States of America.
It has been proven it was the United States of America that started the quote-unquote Spanish flu. But this flu probably started in China, but was it spread from China to the rest of the world? And that's the interesting question. And then how was it spread? And we know so little about this flu because it's new. You know, it's a new virus. And we're stumbling around, but we're slowly learning more and more about it. So for people to attack Asians, and this is not necessarily Chinese, but any Asian walking down the street, you know, especially senior citizens, and beating them up because we think that the attackers believe that the Chinese brought the flu to the United States as well as the rest of the world. You know, to me, it's terrible. The hate crimes.
I think it's horrifying.
Yes.
And it's despicable, and it's got to be called out at every single turn. Turning to a happier direction for a moment. I can say from my rather limited knowledge in terms of history of Las Vegas, and lamentably I would say that my knowledge of the history of Las Vegas is more what I would call the popular history, or the history in the popular mind, where, some of it true and some of it fanciful fiction of characters like Benjamin Siegel coming to the Las Vegas area and beginning this entire kind of notion of grand resorts and so forth. Speaking from diversity of populations, specifically the Chinese population, going back a very, very long time in the West, meaning the West Coast of the United States, there had been a strong emigration of Chinese people to the United States, who were actually at that time treated very poorly as well. How did these people originally come to be in the Las Vegas area, and what was the draw? In other words, if you could just give us a little bit of a historical timeline, what drew Chinese people to the region and what kept them there and what created a vibrant Chinese community?
Okay. Well, you probably don't even realize this, but the Chinese were actually in the greater Las Vegas area. Actually, they were in Mount Charleston in the 1870s and 80s, and they came there in order to make wood charcoal. And so you have these charcoal kilns scattered not only in Mount Charleston, but up in Ely and in Death Valley and all over the West to make the coal that would be used to fuel the mining equipment and to fuel the trains, the engines, and anything else, heating for the house, you name it. If you used wood coal, the Chinese were probably involved in creating it. But the Chinese really didn't create a settlement until Las Vegas opened in 1905. And the train came through, and what we call Las Vegas a train town because it got started because the train was here. And so the Chinese realized that new towns needed laundrymen and cooks. And so right away, some of the earliest residents were cooks and laundrymen. And one of the families that eventually came was the Fung family, and they even opened a restaurant. They opened many restaurants, but one of them was, of course, Fung Gardens on Charleston near Fremont. And then...
Go ahead, please, go on.
Okay, and then the laundrymen came to do the washing and eventually steam washing. And one of the interesting things about the laundries in Nevada is that they introduced a game which we call today Keno, and you have 8 numbers and you pick so many numbers and you could win something. And when people found out that you could play Keno and win money from it, if you take your laundry to the Chinese laundry, you see a growth of Chinese laundry patrons among the population. So those are some of the things that got started, but what we see is that the Chinese population, which at one time in Nevada was almost 10% of the population, drops because of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act and really doesn't get started to grow again until after World War II.
So am I right to believe that this movement to Las Vegas, and for lack of a better term, what I'll call the greater Las Vegas area, such that as it was so many decades ago, was the point of where these folks came from originally? Would that have been San Francisco? Was there another point where people had originally come to the country and then they were coming from, or was it primarily San Francisco?
No, it was all over. The Fung family, the Fung clan, that started the first restaurant, which was the Rainbow Cafe, and then the Silver Cafe, and then Fung's Garden. They came actually, the original person actually was working for General Fremont in the campaign in Arizona and Texas, and then came from there into Las Vegas. So the Las Vegas Chinese actually came from many different places before settling in Las Vegas and finding that this was an environment that they liked. No snow, the weather was pretty good, the people were friendly, and unlike many towns in the West, Las Vegas didn't have a strict residential restriction policy. You could live almost anywhere in Las Vegas, almost, not everywhere, but almost everywhere. And so that allowed them to live in different parts of Las Vegas, and is probably one of the reasons why there was never a residential Chinatown in Las Vegas.
Interesting is, I know my ignorance is profound, but hopefully profound ignorance doesn't turn into, I think too many people suffer from profound ignorance and it turns into profane thinking. I recognize my ignorance is profound, but I hope I'm never profane. I always looked in the United States. I'm originally from New York City. Mm-hmm. And although my forebears did not come through Ellis Island, they actually landed directly on one of the piers in Manhattan. Wow. Ellis Island was one of the entryways, or the prime entryway on the East Coast, and so I've got this very lamentably myopic, everybody came through Ellis Island. Well, everybody obviously did not come through Ellis Island. Was the original port where Chinese people had migrated from, was that originally San Francisco on the West Coast?
Yes, it was. It was San Francisco, and it was the Pacific Mail Steamship Company warehouse where they had to enter in and you might say check in with customs or the immigration officials who were part of the customs department. And then eventually the Americans built Angel Island, which was called the western version of Ellis Island. And what a lot of people didn't realize is that anyone coming from Asia or that direction into the United States went through Angel Island. And so you even have Russians, and you have Poles, and you have Jews, and you have Mexicans coming in through Angel Island into the United States. And primarily because it's off of San Francisco becomes the major immigration point. But there were other immigration areas that the Chinese would come into, such as Seattle was one area of immigration, and eventually Los Angeles and San Diego will be immigration entry points.
To put things, Doctor, in a kind of global perspective, I'll take a step back. I remember, and please forgive me for my inevitable butchering of Chinese names and anything in Chinese names, and anything in Chinese, but 25 years ago, I had the good fortune to meet a gentleman who had come to the United Nations in New York, and he was working on things that had to do with, I believe it was called the Shenzhen Free Enterprise Zone in China. Yes. And it was a fascinating person, and I even invited him to my office, and we had a good number of conversations. And from that, I attempted on my own to do, I wouldn't call it a deep dive, but I remember to this day I read I think it was called A History of Chinese Civilization by a professor named, I think it was Gurnet. I think it was Jacques Gurnet. Maybe it was French, because I think it was a translation.
It was a translation, yes.
Yeah, and I read, I think by, I don't know if it was Dr. Fung Yulan, I think it was like a history of philosophy. But one book struck me in particular, and I want to swing around to it, which was a book called China Deconstructs by Goodman and Siegel, I think it was. And they were talking about the integrity of China itself. Would, for lack of a better term, the center in modern-day China hold in the face of a kind of a push toward integration with the rest of the world on the basis of economic activity. And so I have a question in two parts. The first part is, could you kind of give some context to where China is in terms of its look outward to engage with the world, specifically trade and economics and politics? And then taking that in mind, why have we not seen a greater push by China itself and Chinese entities into Las Vegas, considering that you have a strong population, there is a Chinatown, there is the historic emigration coming from the West, and Nevada, as opposed to a place like the densely packed Northeast or California, which may have certain disadvantages tax-wise, why hasn't there been a wholesale push by Chinese companies and by other entities in China into Las Vegas? And before you respond, I mean, I do know that there are a good number of Chinese companies that have availed themselves of creating wholly owned subsidiaries where they're Nevada-based corporations, but it's a legal convenience. Why haven't we seen more of a thrust from China and Chinese companies into Las Vegas with everything Las Vegas and Nevada has to offer?
Well, first you have to realize or remember that China was still not a major world power or an economic power until very recently. And by recently, I mean it probably didn't get started off the ground until 1980 or later. So you have a country that has been very weak, you know, until, in modern times, very weak. It was stronger in earlier times and probably would have industrialized faster than the Western world if it had not been ruled by the Manchus, a nomadic tribes group that was one of the 50-somewhat minorities in China. And so what we see happening is they slowly began to advance, and then they began to modernize very rapidly after 1980, so that those who lived at 2000 could remember the days when there were hardly any cars, there were very few conveniences, where you had to measure out how much oil you used because you were only allotted so much oil per month, and things like that. Now there are the very rich in China, and the government is trying to eliminate the very poor in China in a very interesting way. China has been reaching out in recent decades to the rest of the world and has established the quote-unquote new Silk Road into Europe and established trade along that route and so forth. They've also aided in the economic development of Africa and other nations that were traditionally regarded as third world countries and very poor. What has happened is that in its advance, it's sort of, and its growing GDP, gross national product, it's now seen as a rival to the United States. And so the United States has taken a negative perspective on China and its development. And the reason why they haven't really made great inroads into Las Vegas is they tried. There was a casino that opened for 2 years from 2016 to 2018, and most of the investors were Chinese from China, and they were hoping that it would go, but again, they didn't have the know-how to make that casino run successfully. So we have the problem of being unfamiliar with how to operate businesses on the American practices and foundation. And so that's one problem. The other problem is that they're really focused more in the other direction. They're looking at Europe they're looking at Africa, they're looking at South America, and they're not really looking that much to the United States because they feel the United States is well developed, and right now, well, for the last administration, was a hostile administration to what they were desiring to do.
So if I understand in business terms, China writ large is looking for the relative low-hanging fruit of lesser developed places, because lesser developed areas are more likely to invite trade with China, and what we saw lamentably, beyond lamentably, shamefully, in the last administration was a cultivation and fanning the flames of xenophobia, which makes investment in the United States, no matter where it is, less appealing. One of the reasons that kind of brought me to this question is I know how important gaming has been for American entities in China. I mean, not China per se, but Macau. And I believe, and I don't spend a lot of time looking at this, that it's been remarkably profitable. Some people might say that it's actually been, it's their number one, it's their leader, like to an extent. I read that one corporate entity in Las Vegas was really thinking like, maybe we'll just sell off everything in Las Vegas because after all, we've got Macau, and maybe we'll go other places in the United States. And I believe, you brought up gross national product. When we look at how the debt in the United States is on par with and or surpassing, depending on what numbers you talk about, the gross domestic product of the United States, and when you look at the terrible, terrible economic plight the United States faces in terms of structure of certain of our programs, be they Social Security, be they Medicare or Medicaid, which nobody seems to be talking about anymore. And a lot of these programs are set to, all of a sudden they won't be, I don't think they're easy to fund now. They're going to be far more difficult to fund. And if you look at state levels of debt, I think you're going to see a lot more gaming around the country because, to put it in the vernacular, baby needs new shoes. So all of a sudden, states that were not very enthusiastic about gaming are going to turn around and say, well, where are we going to get the money from? If we tax people too heavily, they'll move out of state. So, let's see everything we can legalize and tax. Well, the more they do that, the less gaming will hold sway in Las Vegas, I suspect. That being said, I think you've broken it down very, very well for us, but I think it's so unfortunate in the way that I think that China has an awful lot to offer the United States of America, and I have no doubt that the United States of America has a lot to offer China. I think the thing that's lamentable, and perhaps you could dispossess me of this notion if I'm wrong, is that there are some people who focus on this and see a lot of opportunity there, but in the popular mind, I think people are stuck almost in movie representations of China from the Boxer Rebellion over 100 years ago, or the movie Sand Pebbles with Steve McQueen from the 1960s, and I don't know if the average person really understands what has taken place in China and how really, if we had a different outlook and an outlook of constructive engagement, not only could we probably have that lead to a more peaceful world, but we could have more profitability for all. Am I off in left space? Am I projecting something that history doesn't underpin, or is there something to what I'm saying?
There's something to what you're saying. And one of the problems is that there's a duality in the American mind. On the one hand, there is a group that is becoming more vocal who sees China in very negative lights regardless of what is going on. And then there's the other half of the mind where people are enthusiastic about what China is doing, and they see the advances, the new developments, the research that has been done, and are, praising them and urging them to go forward. But what's happened is the government of the United States has taken a a stand back and sort of a hands-off of China and following the more negative line rather than the positive line. And there are scholars and business leaders who are trying to guide the United States to be more open-minded about what China is doing and what their developments are. And in order to understand China, you have to understand its history and its culture, because a lot of what they do is rooted in their history and their culture, which comes from a different basis than Western civilization, which is based on Greco-Roman law and Greco-Roman philosophy and ideas.
Just absolutely fascinating. I'd love to have you back really for a much more long-form conversation, because you're such a phenomenal wealth of knowledge on this, and I'm sure your talk with the Neon Museum is going to be absolutely compelling, but there's so much here.
Yes.
And there is such a contribution by the Chinese community to Las Vegas. And beyond that, I think there are so many opportunities between the United States and China, and consequently between China and Las Vegas and Nevada. So I really thank you for being able to shed some light on some of these compelling and important points. Chris?
Professor Chung, why should people visit the Chinatown Plaza when they are visiting Las Vegas?
You should visit the Chinatown Plaza area because it offers a little bit of an insight into things Chinese. There is some posters and lectures and things like that dealing with Chinese culture and ideas. There are shops from different parts of Asia. There are foods from different parts of Asia. It's not just Chinese, and it's not just Southern Chinese, but there's Northern Chinese and Western Chinese and Island Chinese and, all different kinds of Chinese food. It shows you the multiplicity of the Asian population. There's Korean food and Japanese food, but even within those, different types of Korean and Japanese food. So you can get a taste of all of this without ever going to Asia. So in that sense, it's a lot of fun. And if you go at Chinese New Year's, they always have a Chinese New Year celebration with food samples and dancing and music and all kinds of activities, fortune telling and who knows whatever they can come up with. Every year it's different.
So for Dr. Fawn Chung, featured columnist Jay Bilstein, and CYInterview, I'm Chris Shanduk.